The September heat blanketed the Northridge University campus. Marcia Northrup adjusted the strap of her gym bag and squinted at the towering athletic complex building. Her first practice as a varsity cheerleader was starting in 20 minutes. The inside of the huge gym smelled of fresh floor polish and sweat. The cheerleaders were already warming up, stretching their muscles at the machine along the mirrored wall. Marcia nervously yanked up her short shorts and headed toward the locker room. "Hey, new girl!" A ringing voice called out to her. A tall blonde with a perfect ponytail stepped closer. "I'm Kelly Bright, team captain. You're Marcia, right? Saw your performance at sectionals." Marcia nodded, noting to herself how Kelly held herself, confident but without arrogance. In high school, cheerleading captains usually acted like prom queens. "You have great technique," Kelly continued, "but it's a little different here. The university level requires total dedication. Are you ready?" "More than ready," Marcia smiled. She wasn't going to pass up this chance. A cheerleading scholarship opened the door to the education she'd dreamed of since childhood. The first practice wasn't easy. Marcia was used to the pressure, but here every move had to be flawless. Kelly raced the team relentlessly, practicing complex supports and synchronized elements. "Stop!" Kelly shouted as another pyramid collapsed. "Marcia, you need to keep your back straight and watch your arms. They're an extension of your body, not rags in the wind." By the end of the workout, her muscles were burning, but Marcia felt satisfied. She'd made it through. Sitting down on a bench, wiping sweat with a towel, she looked around the gym. The slanting rays of the setting sun fell through the large windows under the ceiling. Across the court, the soccer team was finishing warm-ups. "Don't stare so blatantly," the red-haired girl who introduced herself as April whispered as she sat down next to her. "Especially at the captain. Dexter Hatch is off-limits territory." "Why?" Marcia took a sip of water from the bottle. "Because he's a star, a future professional. There's only so much a groupie like us can do," April chuckled. "Plus, they say he's got a girlfriend from the women's golf club." Marcia shrugged. She had no intention of becoming someone's groupie. She had other plans to get a journalism degree and build a career in sports journalism. Cheerleading was just a stepping stone to that goal. At night in the dormitory, she couldn't sleep for a long time. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in her head. Her roommate, a future chemist named Jenna, had been snoring into her pillow for a long time. Outside the window, the leaves of sycamore trees rustled, and somewhere in the distance, music was playing. College life was just beginning. Marcia pulled out her cell phone, opened the notes. "Day 1, she typed. "Met the team. Kelly seems okay. Gotta work on stretching and keeping my back straight. First couple of basic journalism classes tomorrow." She smiled at her thoughts. Everything was working out exactly as she'd planned. All she had to do was follow the rules. No romantic distractions, practice hard, and study. Marcia closed her eyes, envisioning herself interviewing NFL stars 4 years from now. Maybe even some of the guys who were practicing in the gym today. Sleep rolled in unbidden, taking her into a world of future endeavors. October colored the campus in copper tones. Marcia hurried to her next practice, rereading her journalism theory notes. The first month of school had flown by, with barely enough time to sleep between classes, practices, and preparations for the next game. The locker room was bustling with the usual hustle and bustle. Kelly was giving out instructions on the new program the team was to present at the next game. Marcia was changing clothes when her cell phone rang quietly. A message from an unfamiliar number. "Saw your report in the student newspaper. Not a bad analysis of the last game. DH." She reread the text several times before she realized who it was from. Dexter Hatch, the captain of the soccer team, had noticed her article. A short review of the Stanford game she'd written for practice. "Thanks. Glad a professional liked the material," she typed back after much thought. "A professional? Only an amateur with ambition so far. How about we discuss my mistakes over coffee?" Marcia froze. April, peering over her shoulder, whistled, "Wow! And they said he was dating that golfer." "That's just discussing the article," Marcia retorted, but her cheeks flared traitorously. They met at a small coffee shop off campus. Dexter turned out to be nothing like she'd imagined. No starry arrogance, an intelligent, attentive conversationalist with an unexpected knowledge of sports journalism. "My father worked as a sports commentator," he explained. stirring a cooled Americano. "I grew up on reporting and statistics. Your piece reminded me of his style, accurate observations without too much water." They talked until the coffee shop closed. Dexter talked about the intricacies of the game. Marcia shared her future plans. When he offered to walk her to her dorm, she agreed, though an inner voice reminded her of the promise she'd made to herself not to get distracted by romance. The meetings became regular. They found secluded places away from prying eyes, an old library, an abandoned garden behind the science building, quiet cafes in the city. Dexter turned out to be well-read, with a sharp mind and an unexpected sense of humor. "You know, I don't come from a rich family either," he confided one day as they sat on an old park bench. "Everyone thinks that because I'm the captain of the team, there's a lot of money behind me. In reality, I'm only here because of an athletic scholarship, just like you." Marcia squeezed his hand in silence. She was beginning to understand why he avoided rowdy parties and stayed away from the campus social scene, but it was getting harder and harder to hide the relationship. One day, Kelly caught them in an empty gym. "I won't tell anyone," she promised, "but be careful. Especially you, Marcia. Some of the girls on the team dream of getting a spot in the captain's bed. They won't forgive that kind of competition." Dexter was angry at having to lurk. Who cares who's from what circle? The days of social barriers are long gone. "You said yourself that it's important for your agent to have the right image," Marcia reminded him. "A rising soccer star should be dating someone more in line with his status." "I don't care about the agent. I'm tired of pretending." He kissed her, and all arguments melted away like smoke. However, reality reminded itself. At important games, Marcia had seen Dexter surrounded by girls from wealthy families, how the coach introduces him to influential alumni, sports photographers catching his every move. And then the strange innuendos began. Randomly overheard snippets of conversation, anxious whispers in the locker room. Something was going on behind the scenes of big-time sports, and Marcia, with her journalistic acumen, couldn't help but notice the warning signs. "Is everything okay?" she asked one evening, noticing that Dexter was particularly tense. "Sure," he smiled strainedly. "Just tired. Big responsibility being captain." Marcia nodded, but a worm of doubt had already settled in her soul. She remembered all too well the lessons of her journalism teacher. Always trust your intuition. If you feel something is wrong, dig deeper. November brought cold rains and new questions. Dexter increasingly canceled appointments, citing extra training. Marcia immersed herself in studying and preparing for midterm exams, trying not to think about the growing chasm between them. But every time she saw him on the field, her heart clenched treacherously. "You've changed," Kelly remarked after a particularly grueling practice. "Falling in love should be exhilarating, not dragging you down." Marcia remained silent. She couldn't explain to her friend that it wasn't about love. Something more loomed on the horizon, dark, disturbing, dangerous, and she didn't know if she was ready to know the truth yet. December was unusually cold. Marcia wrapped herself in a woolen scarf as she hurried across the wind-swept campus toward the athletic complex. She'd noticed a strange pattern in recent weeks. The results of the matches seemed to follow some invisible script. At first, she'd written it off as coincidence, but her journalistic instincts kept her on her toes. Marcia began taking notes, noting unusual moments. Sudden injuries to key opposing players, unexpected substitutions, strange refereeing decisions at crucial moments. That evening, she stayed late in the editorial office of the student newspaper, poring over game statistics. The accumulated data was adding up to a disturbing picture. Footsteps were heard. Dexter appeared suddenly, like a ghost. "What are you doing here so late?" There was ill-concealed alarm in his voice. Marcia covered the numbered notebook with the palm of her hand. "Preparing material for the next issue. Why aren't you at the team party?" "Looking for you." He sat down on the edge of the desk, his gaze sliding over the papers spread out. "What are you working on?" "Just analyzing the season stats." She tried to gather her notes, but Dexter managed to snatch up one sheet. "Betting odds? Marcia, why would you do that?" His face turned hard, alien. "Professional interest. I'm a future sports journalist, remember?" There was a heavy pause. The wind howled outside the newsroom window, and somewhere in the distance the music of a student party could be heard. "Listen," Dexter spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "Some things are best not explored too deeply. For your own good." "Are you threatening me?" "No, God, of course not." He ran his hand over his face. "I'm trying to protect you." "From what? Or from who?" Instead of answering, he pulled her to him, kissed her, desperately, as if for the last time. "Just trust me, please." That night, Marcia couldn't sleep. She went over the events of the last few months in her mind, overhearing Coach Page on the phone, Dexter's unexpected disappearances before important games, the envelopes she'd seen in his locker, the message waiting for her in the morning. "Meet me at our place, we need to talk." Their place, an old gazebo in the far corner of the botanical garden, was buried in freshly fallen snow. Dexter waited for her, pacing nervously on the creaky boards. "I'll explain everything," he began as soon as she appeared. "But first, promise me you won't tell anyone." "Dexter, promise." She'd never seen him like this before, pale, scared, lost. Not at all like the confident captain of the soccer team. "It started last year," he said quickly, as if he was afraid to change his mind. "Small bets at first, then bigger ones. Coach said it would help the team, the university. We need the money for new equipment, scholarships." Marcia listened, feeling the ground go from under her feet. Match fixing, bribery of referees, a criminal scheme that involved dozens of people. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you would have gotten to the truth anyway. That's just the way you are." He smiled sadly. "And because I'm tired of lying, especially to you." Snow fell in large flakes, turning the world around them into a blurry watercolor. Marcia thought about her dream of becoming a sports journalist, about the reputation of the university, about Dexter's future. "What are you going to do?" "What can I do? I'm trapped, Marcia. One wrong move and my career will be over before it starts. What's a career? I could go to jail." She reached out, shook the snow from his hair. "There's always a way out." "No, not this time." He pulled away. "I shouldn't have brought you into this. Forget everything I said, for both our sakes." The next few days turned into an agonizing wait. Marcia tried to focus on training and studying, but her thoughts kept returning to Dexter's confession. She noticed things now that she hadn't seen before. Tense glances between players, quiet conversations in the corners of the locker room, strange visits from strangers in expensive suits. "Are you all right?" Kelly asked after another practice. "It's like you haven't been around lately." "Just tired," Marcia lied. "Session's coming up." But it wasn't about studying. She was faced with the hardest choice of her life. To remain silent was to become an accomplice. To tell the truth would ruin the lives of so many people, including the man she seemed to have fallen in love with. Dexter avoided her, pretended not to notice her at practice, didn't return her texts. Only occasionally did she catch his gaze, heavy, full of unspoken pain and fear. In mid-December, the team was preparing for the final game of the season. Marcia overheard a conversation in the empty hallway of the sports center. Coach Page's voice was muffled, but the words were distinct. "Everything has to be perfect. There's too much at stake." She hid around the corner, waited for the footsteps to subside, pulled out her phone, opened the recorder. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the record button. December 20th, Coach Page discussing the details of the upcoming match. A knock sounded in her room that evening. Dexter stood on the doorstep, pale and determined. "Give me the tape." "What tape?" "Don't pretend. I saw you in the hallway." He stepped inside, shut the door. "You don't realize what you're getting yourself into." "Do you realize? This is a crime, Dexter. You think I don't know?" He almost shouted in a whisper. "But it's not just my life that's at stake now. They know about you. They know you're digging into this case." Marcia felt her back grow cold. "Who knows?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're in danger. We're all in danger." January brought with it not only a new semester, but also an oppressive sense of danger. Marcia tried to behave as usual, attending classes, practicing with the team, working on materials for the student newspaper. But inside, everything turned upside down every time she saw Dexter. He'd changed since Christmas vacation. His smile was strained, shadows under his eyes. At practice, he'd get mad at the players over the smallest things. Marcia noticed how, after another phone call, he'd go to the locker room and stand there for long periods of time, staring at the wall. "What's going on with the captain?" April asked one day during halftime. "It feels like he's been replaced." Marcia remained silent, pretending to be busy stretching. She knew the reason. The entries in her notebook were filling up with new details: betting amounts, names of middlemen, schemes for organizing rigged matches, information that could ruin more than just sports careers. Kelly noticed her condition. After a particularly exhausting workout, she detained Marcia in the empty gym. "You haven't been yourself lately, and it's not like your usual relationship problems." Marcia wiped sweat with a towel, avoiding looking her friend in the eye. "It's fine. It's just a lot of work." "Stop it." Kelly put a hand on her shoulder. "I can tell something's up, something serious. Maybe fatigue was to blame, or the need to share the weight of her secret with someone." Marcia felt the words come off her lips. "Remember the weird match against Berkeley? When ours lost unexpectedly?" Kelly frowned. Of course. There was still a lot of talk about bad luck back then. "It wasn't bad luck." Marcia lowered her voice to a whisper. "Like a lot of things this season." "What are you talking about?" "About some people making a lot of money off our defeats. And victories, too." A heavy pause hung. Somewhere in the hallway, a door slammed and the voices of the last visitors to the sports complex were heard. "Marcia," Kelly spoke very quietly, "do you realize what you're saying? More than, I have proof. Recorded conversations, documents, account statements." "Jesus." Kelly ran a hand over her face. "Dexter knows? He's part of it." Marcia felt her voice shake. "They're all part of it. The coach, some of the players, people in the front office." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't know what to do. If I keep quiet, I become an accessory. If I talk, I ruin the lives of dozens of people." Kelly was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "You have to delete everything. Forget it. Pretend you don't know anything." "I can't. I'm a journalist. It's against everything I believe in. You're a living person first and foremost, and I don't want anything to happen to you." Footsteps were heard again in the hallway. Both froze, but the sound was getting farther away. Kelly lowered her voice even more. "Look, I know people who are connected to the stakes. They're not people to mess with. They will stop at nothing to protect their interests." Marcia felt a chill run down her spine. "You knew?" "I had a hunch. There's a lot of dirt in the world of big sports, but I prefer to stay out of that shit." The next day, Marcia noticed she was being watched. Nothing obvious, just shadows in her peripheral vision, random encounters with the same strangers, cars parked outside her dorm with tinted windows. Dexter caught her after class, dragged her into an empty auditorium, locked the door. "What the hell did you do? Why did you tell Kelly? Were you following me?" "I didn't. They did." His eyes glittered feverishly. "They have their people everywhere. They know your every move. So what now? Now you're in great danger. We're all in danger." He ran his hand through his hair. "Jesus, Marcia, why did you get into all this?" "Because it's the right thing to do. Because people need to know the truth." "The truth?" He grinned bitterly. "What truth? That sports have long since turned into a business? That everyone has a vested interest? Everyone knows that already. But not everyone is involved in crime." "I didn't mean to. I honestly didn't mean to." His voice trembled. It seemed like a game at first. Then it was too late to change things. Marcia looked at him and saw no longer the confident captain she had fallen in love with. Before her stood a frightened man, cornered by his own decisions. "It's not too late to make things right." She touched his arm. "We could—" "No!" He yanked his hand away as if from fire. "There's no we. You have to disappear. Go away. Forget about everything." "You know I won't do that." He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to memorize every feature. "Then I won't be able to protect you." That evening, Marcia sat in the library late into the night, poring over the materials she had collected. The documents were forming a clear picture of the criminal scheme. All that remained was to decide whether to go to the police or straight to the Federal Bureau. It was a particularly chilly January evening. Marcia stayed late in the editorial office of the student newspaper, finishing a story about the funding of the university's athletic programs. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary article about budget allocation. But between the lines, it read something else entirely. The phone vibrated again. This time a message from Coach Page. "Come by after practice. We need to discuss your latest material." She felt her pulse quicken. So they'd read the draft, noticed the hints, realized she wasn't going to back down. The evening cheerleading practice was a blur. Marcia mechanically performed the usual moves, watching the soccer team across the hall with a wary eye. Dexter looked unaccustomedly collected, almost detached. "You seem distracted today," Kelly observed. "Why don't you take the day off?" "No, I'm fine." Marcia gave a strained smile. "Just a lot of work in the newsroom." After practice, the girls pulled into the locker room. Marcia deliberately lingered, pretending to sort through her bag. She needed to get into the coach's office alone without any extra witnesses. "Don't stay too long," Kelly tossed to her as she left. "They're closing early today because of a faculty meeting." Marcia nodded, waited until the footsteps in the hallway died down, pulled out her cell phone, checked to make sure the recording was on. Just in case, she sent a message to a secure inbox, an archive of the collected materials labeled, "Open if something happens to me." The corridor to the coach's room seemed endless. A streak of light shone through from behind the door. Marcia took a deep breath, knocked. "Come in." The coach's voice sounded unaccustomedly muffled. The office smelled of leather and tobacco. Page sat at his desk, poring over some papers. Dexter stood next to him, pale, with a frozen face. "Have a seat." Page nodded at the chair. "We need to have a serious talk." "About what?" Marcia remained standing. "About your fascination with investigative journalism." Coach set the papers aside. "It's commendable when a young reporter takes the initiative, but sometimes it's best to stay out of certain topics." "Are you referring to my funding story?" "That one too." Page drummed his fingers on the desk. "Listen, Marcia, you're a smart girl, should understand how the world works. Big sports is big money, big opportunities, but it's also a lot of responsibility." "Responsibility for what? Match fixing? For laundering money through university funds?" Dexter twitched, but Coach stopped him with a gesture. "For the future, yours and other people's." Page spoke almost affectionately. "Think about the team, about the kids who, thanks to athletic scholarships, got a chance at an education, about the coaches, the teachers. You don't want to ruin their lives, do you?" "What about honesty? Fairness?" Loud words. The coach grinned. "Reality is more complicated than that. Sometimes you have to make compromises for the common good." "The common good or your personal interests?" A heavy pause hung. Footsteps were heard somewhere in the hallway, then hushed. "So you've made up your mind?" Page sighed. "Too bad. We could have worked out a deal. The university needs talented journalists. We could have arranged an internship at a good publication, a stipend raise." "Are you trying to bribe me?" "I'm trying to give you a chance to do the sensible thing." Marcia shook her head. "I'm sorry, Coach, but I've already sent the materials to the editorial board." "What?" Dexter stepped forward. "You couldn't have—" "I did, and I did." She looked him in the eye. "I'm sorry, but I had to." "Get out," Page said quietly to Dexter. "We need to talk in private." Dexter hesitated. His face reflected an internal struggle. "Get out," I said. When the door closed behind him, the coach was silent for a long time, eyeing Marcia. "Do you realize what you've done? This isn't just about money. You're going to ruin Dexter's career. You'll ruin his future. He made his own choices. So did you." Page stood up. "Well, other people will take over from here. Dismissed." Marcia stepped out into the empty hallway. Her heart was pounding somewhere in her throat. She pulled out her cell phone. She needed to call the editorial office to warn. Quick footsteps sounded behind her. She turned around. Dexter. "Wait." He caught up with her at the entrance to the locker room. "Let's talk. One last time." "About what? Everything's already been said." "No, not everything." He opened the door. "Please, 5 minutes." Marcia hesitated, then stepped inside, Perhaps she really did owe an explanation. The click of the lock sounded unexpectedly loud. At 10 p.m., the janitor, checking the rooms before closing, discovered the body. Marcia was lying by the lockers as if she had fallen asleep. Only the unnatural angle of her neck told a different story. The police arrived 15 minutes later. Detective Reed McCormick, an older man with tired eyes, took a long look at the scene, photographing signs of a struggle, collecting samples, interviewing the staff. "Who was the last person to see the deceased?" he asked a pale as chalk Kelly. "She stayed after practice, said she had to meet with the coach." "What coach?" "Page. He asked me to stop by." At 1 o'clock in the morning, the forensics team was still working in the locker room. Dexter sat on a bench near the entrance, answering the young officer's questions. His words sounded mechanical, like memorized text. "I left right after practice. No, didn't see where she went. No, I don't know if she had a meeting with the coach." And in the newsroom of the student newspaper, the computer screen flashed. A new email in the inbox. Material on financial fraud in the university's athletic department. To be opened in the event of my death. Marcia Northrup. The university campus fell silent, covered in freshly fallen snow. Only the lights were still on outside the athletic complex. The forensics team was finishing up their work at the crime scene. Detective McCormick methodically studied the first witness statements in the empty auditorium that had been converted into a temporary office. The dry lines of the transcripts formed a contradictory picture. He was used to it. In the early days of an investigation, the truth was always hidden behind a web of rumors, speculation, and outright lies. The testimony of Kelly Bright, captain of the cheerleading team, seemed sincere but cautious. The girl spoke of Marcia as a talented and enthusiastic student, avoiding any details of the deceased's personal life. McCormick noted this restraint. Usually close friends were more talkative. Ashley Weaver, a third-year cheerleader, behaved very differently. Her story about slutty Marcia, who was allegedly having an affair with Dexter despite having a boyfriend, was full of feigned outrage. The detective recognized the falsity immediately. Too much emotion, too little specificity. The administrative staff of the university spoke with a united front. The dean of the physical education faculty, Dr. Harrison, radiated official sympathy and a stressed willingness to cooperate. At the same time, all of his responses were measured, as if rehearsed in advance. Coach Page kept his cool, but McCormick noticed the corner of his eye twitch at the mention of Marcia's latest article. The soccer team displayed a remarkable unanimity of ignorance. Only one substitute player, glancing around nervously, mentioned the recent arguments between Marcia and the team captain. However, he preferred to keep the details to himself. By the evening of the second day's investigation, the picture remained just as murky. McCormick studied the board of photographs and notes in his office. Something important was escaping his attention. He sensed it with a professional instinct honed over 20 years on the job. Forensics had found an encrypted archive on Marcia's computer, sent an hour before her death. The contents of the email remained a mystery, but the subject line was about financial fraud in the athletic department. When it was completely dark outside the window, the clerk on duty reported a visitor from the university's finance department. McCormick glanced at his watch, 23:15. Too late for an ordinary visit. Then someone was ready to talk. Someone who knows the real background of what happened. The detective turned on the desk lamp and pulled out a blank notebook. Experience told him that such nighttime encounters were often the turning point in an investigation. The visitor was an unassuming man in a wrinkled suit. He introduced himself as Robert Andrews, a junior accountant in the finance department. McCormick studied him carefully. Pale face, nervous movements, constantly running eyes. The classic type of a man who's being dragged down by something. Andrews' story confirmed the detective's hunch. The accountant brought in documents about strange cash movements through the athletic department. Huge sums of athletic grants passed through a series of dummy accounts and charitable foundations, returning to the university administration in the form of bonuses and incentive payments. McCormick carefully gathered information. Interviews with witnesses, financial records, surveillance footage. It was all coming together into a coherent picture. Marcia Northrup was onto something big, a scheme involving powerful people at the university. The next morning, the detective inspected the locker room again. In light of the new information, every detail looked different. The signs of a struggle suggested that Marcia knew her killer. She had let him in on her own, not expecting an attack. On the floor, forensics found a scrap of paper with numbers on it, a fragment of some kind of financial statement. Dexter Hatch looked a lot more suspicious now. McCormick looked into his record, a brilliant athlete with a bright future. Sports publications were already touting him as a rising star. Several professional clubs were showing interest. Re-interviewing Coach Page revealed an interesting detail. Shortly before his death, Marcia requested documents about the funding of the soccer program. Officially, it was for an article about the development of college sports, but her notes found on the computer spoke of a different interest. Kelly Bright, called back in for a second interview, finally recounted her last conversation with her friend. Marcia hinted at some kind of dirt that could destroy the careers of not only individual athletes, but the reputation of the entire university. Gradually, a system was emerging, a perfectly calibrated mechanism for turning athletic success into personal enrichment. Contractual matches brought not only direct income from bets, but also provided a steady stream of subsidies. The silence of the players was bought with promises of future contracts and sports careers. Another board appeared in the detective's office. On it, the scheme of money flow, names of those involved, dates of strange coincidences in the results of matches. In the center was a picture of Marcia, a girl who had learned too much. Forensics decrypted part of her computer archive, emails, bank statements, phone records. Marcia was preparing a major exposé. She wasn't just going to write a story. She planned to turn the material over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. McCormick methodically checked the alibis of all the suspects. Coach Page had indeed left his office at 9 p.m. The security cameras confirmed it. Dean Harrison was at a charity dinner. Most of the team's players were in the dorms. But the janitor's statement made the detective wary. One person returned to the athletic center later. A camera at the back entrance caught a familiar figure in a sports jacket. The time was 9:30, just as Marcia was about to finish talking to the coach. The individual pieces of the mosaic were beginning to fit together. Motive, opportunity, access to the room, knowledge of the victim's habits, all pointed to a man Marcia trusted, a man who couldn't allow the material she'd gathered to be publicized. All that was left was to find one last piece of evidence, something that would turn circumstantial evidence into hard facts. McCormick knew it was out there, in letters, documents, the occasional clause of a witness. The key was not to spook the suspect before his time. That evening, the detective received the forensic results. They found traces of skin under Marcia's fingernails. On her cell phone, a partially erased but recovered message. Forensics were working on decrypting another piece of computer data. The suspect pool was narrowing. McCormick sensed the denouement was near. McCormick interrogated Dexter Hatch in an empty auditorium. The evening light fell on the soccer team captain's face, emphasizing the dark circles under his eyes and the tense line of his cheekbones. "Let's not talk about where you were that night. Let's talk about why." The detective spread out the documents from Marcia's archives in front of Dexter. $500,000. That's exactly how much the university received as a subsidy after your bizarre victory over Berkeley. Dexter was silent, staring at one point. "And here's an interesting document, a letter of recommendation from a scout for a professional club, dated the day after that match. Not a bad bonus for getting the game right? "You don't understand." Dexter's voice sounded muffled. "These aren't just games. It's a system. Everything is tied to results, subsidies, funding, careers. Tell me about it. You know how I got here? Athletic scholarship, the only chance I had to get out of poverty, and then Coach Page explained how it works. Winning brings money to the university. Money secures the future. You just have to play by the rules." McCormick pulled out a printout of bank transfers. "By whose rules, Dexter?" "It seemed right at first. We got what we deserved. The university grew. The players got prospects. No one suffered. Except Marcia." Dexter flinched at the mention of her name. She was different. Didn't understand that sometimes you had to turn a blind eye to certain things. Believed the truth was more important than anything else. And that truth cost her life. I tried to explain. Said her article would ruin more than just my career. It would destroy the entire university. deprive dozens of talented kids of a chance at an education. But she wouldn't listen. McCormick laid out the new documents. Found it on her computer, a complete list of betting matches over 3 years, amounts bet, names of middlemen, money laundering schemes through university funds. She was going to turn it over to the FBI. I know. Dexter covered his face with his hands. She told me about it that night. Said she couldn't keep quiet anymore. So you decided to stop her? No, I just wanted to talk. Convince her. In the locker room? After everyone left? There was a long pause. Outside the window, the voices of students rushing to their evening classes could be heard. I loved her, Dexter finally said. I really did, but she was going to destroy everything I'd worked for, my dream, my future. Tell me what happened in the locker room. She wouldn't listen, talked about morality, integrity, journalistic duty. I tried to explain that without this system, people like us have no way up, that college sports have long lived by those rules. And when did she refuse to keep quiet? Yeah, I didn't mean to, just grabbed her by the shoulders, wanted to shake her, make her understand. She jerked. We struggled. Then she hit her head on the locker. I heard a crunch. Dexter fell silent, his shoulders shaking finely. Did Coach know you were back in the locker room? No, he said to just keep an eye on her. No one wanted her dead. We thought we could work out a deal. McCormick gathered the papers into a folder. You know what the worst part is? She really did love you. They found a draft of a letter in her notes. She was suggesting you leave together, give up all the information, and start over. What? Yes, she believed that your talent would allow you to make an honest path through, was going to help you get out of the system. Dexter slowly raised his head. Tears stood in his eyes. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. It doesn't matter now. The detective stood up. Dexter Hatch, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcia Northrup. As the police took Dexter away, the new team was practicing in the stadium. Players practiced passes, the coach shouted instructions. Life went on. The phone rang in McCormick's office. The Federal Bureau had acknowledged receipt of the university sports corruption files. The investigation was just beginning, and somewhere in the editorial office of the student newspaper lay Marcia's unfinished article, a story about how big money was killing big sports. A story that had cost her her life. The state courtroom resembled a theater, the same rows of seats, the same silence waiting for the drama's finale. The trial of Dexter Hatch lasted 4 days, though everyone realized the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The young man pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and his lawyers skillfully played the card of difficult childhood and victim of circumstances. At the last hearing, Dexter looked haggard. There was no trace of his former athletic college soccer star self. He sat slouched as the prosecutor read the case file, the story of a talented athlete from a poor family caught in a corrupt system. The lawyers had done their best. They called dozens of witnesses, school teachers who recalled a diligent student, neighbors who told how little Dexter worked part-time to help a single mother. Jurors nodded, furtively wiping away tears. The story was heartwarming. The American dream turned nightmare. The subject of match fixing and financial fraud came up only in passing. The defense presented it as the pressure of the system on an inexperienced young man who could not resist temptations and threats. The prosecutor did not insist. He was clearly given to understand that it was not worth digging in this direction. The sentence was no surprise to anyone. 5 years suspended sentence, taking into account a sincere confession and positive characteristics. Dexter listened silently to the court's decision. He understood. The real punishment is not in the court verdict. Contracts with professional clubs evaporated even before the trial began. Sports publications, which had recently praised the rising star of soccer, now did not mention the name of Dexter Hatch even in the criminal chronicle. The university officially announced his expulsion for ethical reasons. The investigation into the match-fixing scam stalled almost immediately. The university administration attracted the best lawyers, involved connections in high circles. Tens of thousands of dollars were spent on consultations and expertise. Folders with documents roamed between offices, lost, recovered, lost again. Marcia's evidence was insufficiently convincing. Witnesses changed testimony. Bank statements required additional scrutiny. Federal bureau agents were reassigned. The case was slowly sinking into a bureaucratic quagmire. Coach Page announced his retirement for health reasons. At a farewell banquet, colleagues gave him expensive gifts and made solemn speeches. Dean Harrison was promoted and moved into a new office overlooking University Park. His project to reform the athletic programs received generous funding. The new soccer team was preparing for the season. The young coach implemented modern training techniques. Bookmakers were taking bets. Subsidies flowed into university accounts. The system, based on tacit agreements and mutual responsibility, continued to work like a well-oiled machine. Dexter moved to a small town in a neighboring state. He got a job as a manager at the family sports store. The owner didn't dig deep into his past. He rented a modest apartment, got a dog, started seeing a therapist, tried to start his life with a clean slate. But at night, he was haunted by nightmares. He found himself in that locker room over and over again. He saw Marcia's terrified eyes. He heard the thud of his head hitting the metal locker. He woke up in a cold sweat, realizing the past would never let him go. Sometimes he wondered if he should have listened to her back then. Dare to expose the system together, start over? But it was too late. Marcia believed in justice and died for her beliefs. And he chose cowardly silence and now paid for that choice with a ruined life. On the anniversary of the tragedy, the student newspaper published a short piece in memory of Marcia Northrup, without loud phrases and accusations, just the story of a girl who dreamed of becoming a journalist and changing the world for the better. In the photo, she was smiling, young, beautiful, full of hope. This is how she remained in the memory of those who knew her. And big sport continued to live by its own laws, where truth and justice meant less than the power of money and unspoken agreements. The system was stronger than the loners who dared to challenge it.